I never thought my quiet street would turn into a crime scene right in front of my house. It was late, the kind of night where everything feels still, when the sharp sound of shattering glass cut through the silence. At first, my mind searched for harmless explanations, a fallen branch, maybe some kids fooling around. Then I stepped outside and saw her. The HOA president. She was standing under the streetlight, gripping a heavy hammer, bringing it down again and again onto my visitor's Ford Explorer. Glass exploded onto the pavement with every strike. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Neighbors rushed out of their homes. Phones were raised. Someone yelled for her to stop. I ran toward her, shouting her name, begging her to step back, but she didn't even acknowledge me. She screamed about criminals, about threats to the neighborhood, about how she was protecting the town. That's when it hit me. This had nothing to do with HOA rules anymore. This was raw power on display, and the worst part? People believed her. They stared at me like I was dangerous, like I was guilty. What none of them knew, what she definitely didn't know, was who that car actually belonged to. Because the moment my visitor stepped outside, everything was about to change. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The next HOA meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. It was meant to feel welcoming, but it never did. Folding chairs were arranged in stiff rows. A pot of coffee sat untouched on a side table. Linda Carver stood at the front, flipping through her papers with the calm confidence of someone who already knew how the night would end. I hadn't planned to speak, but as she listed fines and violations, something inside me snapped. When the floor opened for questions, I stood up and asked calmly, why the same rules seemed to apply only to certain residents. I pointed out that similar issues existed throughout the neighborhood, yet the fines always landed on the same small group of people. The room went silent. Linda slowly looked up at me. She wasn't surprised. She looked offended, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. I waited. No one backed me. A few neighbors stared at the floor. Others shifted in their seats. Then voices began to rise, not in support of me, but against me. Someone said strict rules protected property values. Another insisted the HOA was simply doing its job. One person turned toward me and said I should stop causing trouble if I wanted to live there peacefully. Linda never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She smiled, thanked everyone for their input, and moved on to the next agenda item. The message was clear. I was on my own. 2 days later, the pressure started. Another fine appeared. Then another. A notice accusing me of a noise violation on a night I hadn't even been home. A warning about unapproved activity, with no explanation at all. Each notice was small enough to seem harmless, but together, they felt suffocating. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I began to feel watched. Every time I stepped outside, I wondered who was paying attention. Every slow-moving car made my stomach tighten. The neighborhood that once felt calm now felt hostile, like I was living under a microscope. Still, I didn't explode. Instead, I went quiet. Not in meetings, not publicly. Just short, careful conversations, one neighbor at a time. I asked simple questions. Had they ever been fined for similar things? Did the amounts always seem small, almost designed to be paid without argument? The answers came slowly. Yes, yes, and yes. People admitted they'd paid fines they didn't agree with just to avoid trouble. Some had been fined repeatedly until they learned to stay silent. Others said they'd watched violations ignored at certain homes and enforced harshly at others. Fear was what kept the neighborhood quiet. Then the HOA crossed a line they couldn't undo. One night, long after dark, there was a loud knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on my porch, professional and serious. They told me they'd received a 911 call. The report claimed there was suspicious activity inside my home. Dangerous visitors. A potential threat to the neighborhood. My heart dropped. They asked to come in. I let them. They searched every room carefully and respectfully. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Before they left, one of them told me I'd need to come to the station the next day to give a formal statement. When the door closed, the house felt unbearably quiet. For a moment, I considered leaving, selling the house, starting over somewhere else. Then another thought settled in. If I walked away, this wouldn't end. It would just move on to someone else, someone quieter, someone older, someone with less strength to fight back. That night, I made a decision. I stopped confronting them. I stopped reacting. I stopped giving them anything they could twist. Instead, I started documenting everything, every notice, every fine, every interaction, dates, times, patterns. If they wanted a fight, I would let them believe I was retreating. While I gathered the truth, the next HOA meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. It was designed to feel friendly, but it never did. Folding chairs sat in rigid rows. A pot of coffee rested untouched on a side table. At the front of the room, Linda Carver flipped through her papers with calm confidence, like she already knew how the night would end. I hadn't planned to speak, but as she listed fines and violations, something inside me snapped. When the floor opened for questions, I stood up and calmly asked why the same rules seemed to apply only to certain residents. I pointed out that similar issues existed all over the neighborhood, yet the fines always landed on the same small group of people. The room went silent. Linda slowly looked up at me. Her expression wasn't surprise. It was disbelief, as if I'd broken an unspoken rule. For a moment, no one moved. I waited for someone to say something. No one did. A few neighbors stared at the floor. Others shifted in their chairs. Then voices began to rise, not in support of me, but against me. Someone said strict rules protected property values. Another insisted the HOA was just doing its job. One person turned toward me and said I should stop causing trouble if I wanted to live there peacefully. Linda never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She smiled, thanked everyone for their input, and moved on to the next agenda item. The message was clear. I was alone. 2 days later, the pressure started. Another fine appeared. Then another. A notice accusing me of a noise violation on a night I hadn't even been home. A warning about unapproved activity, with no explanation at all. Each notice was small enough to seem harmless, but together they felt suffocating. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. I started to feel watched. Every time I stepped outside, I wondered who was paying attention. Every slow-moving car made my stomach tighten. The neighborhood that once felt calm now felt hostile, like I was living under a microscope. Still, I didn't explode. Instead, I went quiet. Not in meetings, not publicly. Just careful conversations, one neighbor at a time. I asked simple questions. Had they ever been fined for similar things? Did the amounts always seem small, almost designed to be paid without protest? The answers came slowly. Yes, yes, and yes. People admitted they'd paid fines they didn't agree with just to avoid trouble. Some had been fined repeatedly until they learned to stay silent. Others said they'd seen violations ignored at certain homes and enforced harshly at others. Fear was what kept the neighborhood quiet. Then the HOA crossed a line they couldn't undo. One night, long after dark, there was a loud knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers stood on my porch, serious and professional. They told me they'd received a 911 call. The report claimed there was suspicious activity inside my home. Dangerous visitors. A potential threat to the neighborhood. My heart dropped. They asked to come in. I let them. They searched every room carefully and respectfully. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Before they left, one officer told me I'd need to come to the station the next day to give a formal statement. When the door closed, the house felt unbearably quiet. For a moment, I considered leaving. Selling the house, starting over somewhere else. Then another thought settled in. If I walked away, this wouldn't end. It would just move on to someone else, someone quieter, someone older, someone with less strength to fight back. That night, I made a decision. I stopped confronting them. I stopped reacting. I stopped giving them anything they could twist. Instead, I started documenting everything, every notice, every fine, every interaction. Times, patterns. If they wanted a fight, I would let them believe I was retreating. While I gathered the truth, I did exactly what they expected. I went quiet. No more complaints, no more questions at meetings. I paid the next fine without argument. I smiled when I passed HOA workers on the sidewalk. I let Linda believe the pressure had worked. But behind closed doors, everything changed. My phone was always with me, fully charged. Storage cleared. Every time I stepped outside, I paid attention. I stopped assuming things were accidents and started watching patterns. It didn't take long. One afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a dark smear near the edge of the pavement. Oil. Fresh, too fresh, too fresh. I hadn't parked there all day. I stepped back and waited. Less than an hour later, an HOA maintenance truck rolled past my house and slowed to a stop. One of the workers got out, glanced around, and nudged the spill with his boot just enough to spread it wider. I recorded everything. That wasn't luck. That was confirmation. After that, I started noticing more. HOA workers passing late at night, casually dropping debris near my yard. A bag of leaves torn just enough to spill across my driveway. Trash shifted a few feet out of place. Nothing dramatic, just enough to justify another fine. Every time, I documented it. Photos, videos, wide shots and close-ups. Timestamps visible, files backed up in more than one place. But the harassment wasn't the worst part. The fines were. They were always small, just under the amount that would make someone call a lawyer. Just low enough to feel irritating instead of devastating. The kind people paid just to make the problem disappear. That wasn't accidental, so I followed the money. A friend I trusted helped me review publicly available HOA records, budgets, vendor payments, annual filings. On the surface, everything looked normal. But when we slowed down, patterns appeared, thousands collected in fines each year, yet the totals never quite matched. Vendor expenses inflated, maintenance costs repeated with vague descriptions. Payments routed to the same small group of contractors, some sharing last names with board members. And the fine revenue? Large portions never reached the HOA's general fund. It was being siphoned off. Quietly, consistently. Just enough to stay hidden. Linda Carver wasn't enforcing rules. She was running a system built on fear and silence. Residents least likely to fight back were targeted. Fines stayed small to discourage resistance. Loyal insiders benefited, while the neighborhood stayed divided. The more I uncovered, the heavier it felt. This wasn't just about me. It was about elderly neighbors paying fines they didn't understand. Single parents choosing between groceries and HOA notices. People who believed they were alone. Just like I had, that's when it became clear. They weren't trying to force compliance. They were trying to wear me down. Make me doubt myself. Make me feel watched. Make me leave. If I sold my house quietly, the problem would disappear for them. That realization changed everything. I stopped thinking defensively and started thinking strategically. I stopped reacting to each notice and focused on the bigger picture. I didn't need to prove every violation was staged. I needed to expose the pattern. By the time I was ready, my evidence was organized. My timeline was solid. My phone was full. And I still hadn't said a word. Linda seemed satisfied. The fines slowed. The warnings softened. The neighborhood felt almost calm again. That should have worried me. Because when people like her go quiet, it usually means something bigger is coming. I didn't know when it would happen. I didn't know how far she would go, but I knew one thing. The next move wouldn't be subtle, and when it came, it would expose everything she'd been hiding. That evening began like any other quiet night in Ridgewood Falls. The sun had barely slipped below the rooftops when a close friend of mine pulled into the neighborhood. He was in town briefly and stopped by without warning. Nothing unusual. He parked his dark gray Ford Explorer in the shared guest area down the street. The vehicle was registered, clean, and parked exactly where visitors were allowed. No rules broken. We had barely sat down when I heard tires crunch on gravel outside. Then footsteps. Heavy, angry. I looked out the window, and my stomach dropped. Linda Carver was marching down the street like she owned it. Her shoulders were tight, her jaw clenched. In her hand was a heavy hammer, something meant for construction, not conversation. Before I could react, she reached the Ford Explorer. And she swung. The crack was violent. Glass exploded as the windshield collapsed inward, scattering across the pavement. She raised the hammer again and slammed it into the side window. Then again, and again. Each strike shattered the quiet further. Doors opened up and down the street. Porch lights flicked on, phones came up. Someone shouted her name. Someone else yelled for her to stop. She didn't. I ran outside barefoot, heart pounding, shouting for her to stop. I begged her to drop the hammer. I told her she was crossing a line she couldn't undo. She never looked at me. Her face was twisted with rage as she screamed that criminals were meeting in my house, that I was running something dangerous, that people like me were a threat to the neighborhood. She claimed she had warned me, that this was what happened when I refused to listen. She kept swinging. Glass rained onto the street. The side mirror snapped off and hit the pavement. Metal screamed as the hammer dented the door. This wasn't vandalism anymore. It was a performance, one fueled by years of unchecked authority and the belief that consequences didn't apply to her. She looked unstoppable, like someone who truly believed the law didn't touch her. And then I noticed the crowd. Not everyone looked shocked. Some looked unsure, a few nodded. One man even shouted that she was doing the right thing, that if the HOA president said there was danger, then there must be. That hurt more than the destruction. I wasn't just watching a car being destroyed. I was watching how fear trained people to believe authority, no matter how insane it looked. Then the door behind me opened. My friend stepped outside. At first he said nothing. He took in the crowd. Linda, the hammer. Then his eyes locked onto the Ford Explorer, what was left of it. He stopped, not in anger, not in panic, just still. Like his mind was catching up to what he was seeing. Shattered glass, crushed metal, phones recording. The HOA president standing over his vehicle like she'd won something. For a brief moment, the entire street went quiet. Even Linda paused, chest heaving, sweat streaking her face. My friend took a slow breath. And that's when I knew. This wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. For a moment, it felt like the street had already made its decision. People weren't looking at Linda anymore. They were looking at me. Whispers spread through the crowd, accusations disguised as concern. Someone muttered that I had finally been exposed. Another neighbor spoke louder, telling Linda she'd done the right thing, that she'd stepped in before something worse happened. One woman folded her arms and nodded, saying she'd always felt something was off about me, that quiet people were usually hiding something. Each word landed heavier than the last. Linda fed off it. She lifted her chin, breathing hard, gripping the hammer like proof of her authority. She shouted that this was exactly why she had power to act before danger spread. She pointed at me and told the crowd I had forced her hand. That resistance always led to consequences. Anger rose in my chest, but something colder settled beneath it. Understanding. This was how she survived, not through rules or law, but by turning people against each other. Then my friend moved. He still hadn't raised his voice. Still hadn't argued. He walked to a nearby porch, pulled over a chair, and carried it into the middle of the street. He placed it beside Linda, slow and deliberate, like he was setting a stage. The crowd watched, confused. He asked calmly if someone could hand him a bottle of water. A neighbor hesitated, then stepped forward and did. He unscrewed the cap, held it out to Linda, and suggested she sit down before she hurt herself. The request was so unexpected, it broke her momentum. She stared at him, baffled. Sweat streaked her face. Her hands shook now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. She laughed sharply and told him to get away from her car. He didn't move. He simply waited. Something about his stillness unsettled her. Slowly, almost without realizing it, she lowered herself into the chair. The hammer slipped from her hand and hit the pavement with a dull sound. Phones kept recording. My friend crouched slightly so he was at eye level with her. Only then did he speak. He gave his name. He said it clearly. Then he said what he did for a living. The reaction was immediate. Someone in the back sucked in a breath. Another neighbor froze mid-recording. A voice whispered, "That can't be right." Linda's face drained of color. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out wrong. She said this was a private HOA matter. She asked what kind of game he thought he was playing. He nodded, as if he understood. Then he clarified calmly. His role, his jurisdiction, the level at which he worked. Federal cases. The street went completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Linda's eyes darted around, searching for support. She found none. The same neighbors who had defended her moments earlier suddenly avoided her gaze. Arms unfolded, shoulders stiffened. Phones stayed raised, but now they weren't cheering. They were documenting. My friend stood up slowly. He gestured toward the Ford Explorer, toward the shattered glass and crushed metal scattered across the pavement. He explained plainly that the vehicle belonged to him, that it was government registered, that it had been destroyed in front of witnesses on video without provocation. He didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. He stated facts. Linda tried to speak, but her words tangled. She said she didn't know, that she assumed. He stopped her gently. Assumptions, he said, didn't override the law. Then he turned to the crowd. He thanked them for recording, for staying present, for witnessing what accountability looked like when authority was abused in public. That's when the shift happened. You could feel it. The people who had judged me moments earlier avoided my eyes. A few stepped back, as if distance could erase their words. One man muttered an apology to no one in particular. Linda looked smaller now, not powerful, not righteous, just exposed. Police sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. My friend finally looked at me. He didn't smile. He just gave a small nod. And in that moment, I knew the story she'd been telling about me and about herself had collapsed in front of everyone. The color didn't just drain from Linda's face. It vanished. One moment, she was still trying to stand tall, clinging to the idea that she could talk her way out of it. The next, her shoulders sagged and her eyes locked onto my friend like she was staring at something inevitable. She recognized his name. You could see it in the way her lips parted, then stopped. This wasn't just any official. He worked in federal law enforcement, the kind of role that didn't rely on noise or threats. The kind built on quiet authority and long memory. Whatever confidence Linda had left collapsed. Her voice changed, smaller, rushed. She started apologizing too quickly. said there had been a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high, that she'd acted to protect the community. She offered to pay for the damage. The windows, the entire vehicle, anything. She even tried to laugh weakly, like humor could undo what had already happened. No one reacted. The silence around her had changed. This wasn't shock anymore. It was judgment. My friend listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once and said compensation wouldn't change the evidence. Apologies wouldn't erase what had already been documented. Then he looked at me. I stepped forward and handed him everything. Photos of oil deliberately spilled near my driveway. Videos of debris being placed after dark. Screenshots of threatening emails. Audio recordings where intimidation wasn't even subtle. Financial records showing missing fine revenue and inflated expenses. Dates, times, names, months of quiet work. Linda's hand started to shake. She tried one last time, asked if this could be handled internally. Privately, suggested lawyers could sort it out. He told her it already was being handled. Police arrived minutes later. This time, no one defended her. Neighbors shared their videos. Others stepped forward, finally speaking about things they'd stayed silent about for years. By morning, the case was open, and Linda Carver was no longer in control of anything. In court, she sat alone. No board members. No supporters. The same people who once praised her leadership suddenly had no memory of standing beside her. The HOA's legal team withdrew early, citing conflicts. The evidence spoke for itself. Video showed her destroying the vehicle. Audio captured her accusations and threats. Financial records exposed years of selective enforcement and missing funds. Witnesses followed. Residents who had paid fines out of fear. People targeted because they were quiet. Former insiders who admitted certain names were enforced and others ignored. Even police officers testified about false emergency calls and reports that never matched reality. My friend testified last. Calm. Precise. Factual. He explained the damage, the jurisdiction, and why that night triggered a deeper investigation. Linda didn't look up. Her attorney argued stress, authority, misjudgment. The judge dismissed it. Authority didn't excuse crimes. The verdict came without drama. Guilty on multiple counts. The sentence followed: prison time, heavy fines, permanent removal from any HOA or civic leadership role. Everything she built through fear disappeared in minutes. She was led away quietly. Outside the courthouse, sunlight felt different. Not victory, not revenge. Relief. Ridgewood Falls wouldn't heal overnight. But the rules were no longer weapons. The quiet residents weren't invisible anymore. And for the first time since I moved there, the peace promised in the brochure finally felt real. The courtroom felt colder than the night she shattered the windshield, not from the air conditioning, but from what was about to be exposed. Linda sat alone at the defense table, back rigid, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The confidence she once wore like armor was gone. No board members beside her, no supportive neighbors. Just empty seats and the weight of everything she believed she'd hidden. When the judge called the case, the room went still. The prosecution didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They let the evidence speak. Video footage played first. Multiple angles, multiple phones. Linda beneath the streetlight, hammer raised, rage frozen on her face as glass exploded across the pavement. Her voice echoed through the courtroom, shouting about criminals, danger, authority. No edits, no distortions. Just truth. Then came the photos. Oil deliberately poured near my driveway. Debris scattered after midnight. Notices issued hours later for violations that hadn't existed until HOA workers created them. Timestamps aligned. The pattern was undeniable. Financial records followed. ledgers that didn't balance, fines marked as collected but never deposited, HOA accounts missing thousands in small, carefully concealed amounts, too subtle to notice individually, impossible to ignore when shown together. A quiet ripple moved through the gallery. Then the witnesses stood. An elderly man described being fined again and again for landscaping he never changed. A woman testified about noise complaints filed on nights she wasn't even home. A former HOA assistant admitted she'd been told which residents to target, quiet ones, isolated ones, unlikely to fight back. No drama, no speeches. Just truth, stacked carefully until there was nowhere left to hide. Each testimony peeled away another layer of Linda's grip, exposing the full weight of her control. Next came the police officers. They recounted the repeated calls to my home for suspicious activity, calls that had escalated without cause, reports that exaggerated, and in some cases outright fabricated threats. One officer admitted they'd felt uneasy but had deferred to the HOA president's perceived authority. Until the night of the smashed vehicle. That night changed everything. My friend took the stand, calm and measured. He didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts, the damage to his dark gray Ford Explorer, the jurisdictional implications, the severity of vandalizing a vehicle belonging to a federal district attorney. Linda's attorney tried to interrupt, to redirect the narrative, to frame the ordeal as mere stress, a misunderstanding, a community leader pushed too far. The judge cut them off. Stress did not excuse criminal behavior. Authority did not shield abuse. Leadership did not grant immunity. When Linda finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. She claimed she only wanted to protect the community, that she'd been overwhelmed, that mistakes had been made. Mistakes, however, do not leave patterns. Mistakes do not involve coordinated false reports, selective enforcement, and financial manipulation over months. Mistakes do not escalate into harassment, fraud, and property destruction. The judge's decision came swiftly, with the force of inevitability. Guilty. On every major charge: harassment, fraud, abuse of power, filing false police reports, destruction of property, including a federal officer's vehicle. Linda did not cry. She stared straight ahead, as though the word guilty hadn't touched her at all. The sentence followed: years in prison, crushing fines that erased every gain she'd claimed, restitution for every homeowner affected, permanent removal from all HOA positions, and a lifetime ban from any community leadership role. Her career, once built on fear and manipulation, was gone, publicly, permanently. As deputies escorted her from the courtroom, no hand reached out, no whisper of sympathy was offered. The woman who had ruled Ridgewood Falls with intimidation left unnoticed, stripped of every shred of power she thought untouchable. Outside, sunlight bathed the courthouse steps. Neighbors gathered quietly. Some wept, some hugged, some simply breathed, as if releasing years of held tension. For the first time, no one whispered in fear. I stood back and watched. There was no grand celebration, no cinematic cheer. There was only justice. Later, I returned home, brewed a cup of coffee, and stood at the window. Through the glass, neighbors spoke calmly. Children rode bikes freely, doors remained open. The street was quiet. But this time, it was not silence born of fear. It was peace. The street looks the same as it always has, but it no longer feels the same. Morning light washes over the pavement where shattered glass once lay, glittering like a silent warning. The lawns are still trimmed. The houses still line up neatly, just as before. Yet something invisible has lifted. You sense it in the way doors remain open a moment longer, in how neighbors pause to talk instead of hurrying inside, in the laughter that travels freely, without restraint. I stand by the window with a warm cup of coffee, watching it all return to life. Voices carry at a normal volume now. No one lowers their tone. No one scans the street mid-conversation. No one looks over their shoulder. The fear that once governed this place has disappeared. Power built on intimidation never endures. It only feels permanent when you're trapped beneath it. Justice didn't arrive with sirens or speeches. It didn't demand attention or make a show of itself. It came quietly, step by step, through truth, patience, and evidence. And when it finally settled in, it stayed. Ridgewood Falls didn't need a hero. It just needed someone willing to stand firm long enough for the truth to catch up. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been targeted, silenced, or pushed aside by people who believed they were untouchable, know this: you're not alone. For more real HOA stories about power, corruption, and justice, make sure you subscribe to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?